A long 3 years since we've last been together. I am your society president, Jeanette Shaliga. In case you forgot what I looked like or you've only seen me via Zoom, can we please give Tina a very warm welcome and thank you for being here today. Yay!
Thank you, I appreciate it. And here I thought Southwest was going to be exciting. Flying Southwest. This was way more exciting than that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about identifying and interpreting historic photographs. So if you are anything like me, throughout the years you've had boxes of photos passed down to you with absolutely no information associated with them. Not even maybe necessarily which side of the families are represented in these photos. If we take the tools that we already know, if we utilize the research we've already done on our family, eventually, through what I'm going to talk about today, those tips and those tools, how to view photos, you will probably start to identify the unidentified. And it's a process that takes time, especially if you're just starting out with genealogy. Are any of you just starting out? A couple of you. Most of you have been doing this for a while, so you already have a roster of resources and knowledge that you have at your disposal to kind of help you work through these processes. So this is my Grandma Nellie. So it's called Grandma Nellie's scrapbook because I had been given a scrapbook that was created by my grandmother. So my Grandma Nellie is here. My mom is sitting on the car here. So I have a collection of photos that came from my own family that I had to work through that process on. And I apologize that because of what we're looking at here, the quality's not great, but I tried to lighten up the background so you could see these a little bit better. And some of these are on your handout. That's what Jeanette was going to do. She was going to run upstairs.
I forgot about that.
Oh, and print those out so you can actually take them with you. When you're dating your photographs, there's a couple of things that I recommend. If they're already together in a scrapbook or in a photo album or in some type of enclosure, do not take them apart. But if you're already dealing with photos that are just loose in a box, then one of the things I recommend is kind of ballparking your photos together by era. We can instantly tell the difference between black and whites and color. You could tell the difference between tintypes and daguerreotypes. Those all come with specific eras associated with them. So by breaking things down into eras, is this 1860 or 1960? Breaking them down into general locations. Are we dealing with urban environments or are we dealing with rural environments? Can help you start to put things into perspective. Well, I have a whole lot of photos that are in urban environment that are all black and whites. Who could have lived in a big enough city that these could be representative of those families? Or who do we know that lived on a farm? How many ancestral lines do we have where you had farmers in your ancestry? So by breaking it down into categories helps you kind of manage what it is you're dealing with. Am I dealing with a bulk of photos that come from 1940 and 50? Am I dealing with a bulk of photos that are coming from 1870 to 1890? And by getting a feel for what eras you're looking for, you could start to home in on those families. What families would have been represented between 1870 and 1890? What families would have been represented between 1940 and 1950? And it gives you an idea of potential starting points. And for those of you in the back who can't see this, I greatly apologize, but you'll be able to watch the video. When you're looking at photos, and I realize you can't see it all that well, looking at the eras, looking at the style of photo, what is it made out of? Is it a tintype? Is it a daguerreotype? Is it a carte de visite that's on cardboard? Is it a black and white salt print? Is it a color photo? All of those are important, and I'm going to talk about that in just a couple of minutes when I talk about the process of active seeing. But looking at the photo itself, what's in the background? What am I looking at? Actively pulling out details from a photo that you may have looked at 100 times, but you didn't look at it deeply. It might have been a wedding photo and you said, oh, that's just a studio portrait of the wedding couple. But all of the details that could be in that photograph. It could be jewelry that the bride is wearing. It could be glasses or pierced ears, or maybe they weren't wearing wedding rings yet. Those are the types of details that you're trying to pull out to start to put together a dossier. Okay, which women in the family have pierced ears? I'm setting these photos aside. It could be one of these women. Or what men in my family wore eyeglasses. And I'm putting together a dossier of all of the potential people that could be. So by zooming in and focusing more heavily on what you're looking at in the details of the photo, instead of just what it is, can offer a lot of insight as well. And I'm going to show you plenty of examples that hopefully you'll be able to see. If you're lucky enough that it has the photographer's name on it, it's half the battle. Right? Because not only is the photographer's mark going to give you a location, but it's potentially going to give you an era as well. And I'm going to talk about photographer's marks in more detail towards the end a little bit, because I can look through printed resources to find out what years that photographer was in business. And I've just narrowed down my location in my window of time considerably in starting to identify who these potential people might be. But the clothing styles. Sorry, men, male clothing styles do not change anywhere near as rapidly as women's clothing styles do. So if you have a photo that is just men, like in this photo, it could be a little bit more difficult to suss out a time period unless there's something else in the photo that kind of gives it away. And for example, in this photo that's right here, it's a tintype. So I know I have a very specific window, which I'm going to talk about those eras in just a second, but I have a very specific window in which tintypes were being produced. So I know that that photo is not going to be before or after that general window, but the date range in the middle can change a little bit based on that. You know, you're looking for identifiable features like pocket watches, kerchiefs, hats that they're wearing. Are they wearing a certain style of boot? We're looking for those details to try to narrow down. That was a hat that was very popular in this decade. Or for ladies, it's so much easier. You know, that particular hairstyle was really popular at this time, and you can use those little details to drill in further. I already talked a little bit about the style of photography using those eras. Kodaks, post-Second World War, carte de visites up until, you know, the late 1890s, 1900, when they start to move into postcard style images and smaller black and white photographs. So you're using the details of the object itself to narrow down your time period as well. There are a lot of themes and trends in photography that you could take advantage of as well. So beyond just the clothing styles, where you're looking at, you know, full skirts and tight button-down jackets, very specific to the Civil War era, or when you're dealing with big puffy white sleeves and loose buns, you know, the Gibson girl type model, 1890s to early 19-teens, flapper style dresses, A-line style dresses, very particular to the 1960s. So for women, it's a lot easier to kind of put these into categories, but you're looking kind of for the obvious at first. What sets it apart, right? Bouffant hairs from the 1960s. I could put that into a category, and I know that I'm going to come back to that. Or, you know, if they're wearing day bonnets or they're carrying, not umbrellas, I just drew parasols, right? We're putting that into a 19th century category. So you're looking for those general themes when you're starting to separate these out. If you're lucky enough that you already have these in an album, or you already have them together in a photo album, a scrapbook, or some other type of enclosure, somebody's already done the work for you. And the reason why I don't want you to take these apart is because the person who created that album put that album together for a specific reason. It could be by date, they did it chronologically. It could be by family, they broke it down, certain pages were for each surname or each family. It could have been done by event, you know, they were focusing on family vacations, or they were focusing on weddings or some other type of family get-together. So that work is already done for you, and the fact that they're already clumped together by era, most likely era and location, because they're all taken at the same event, or they're all taken at the same family, which would be locational. It's the loose photos where we have to try to figure this out on our own, because there's no guidance, there's no path to figure that out. So photographers' backgrounds and props can be a really big part of that as well. So if you have a studio portrait, but you're not lucky enough to have the photographer's name embedded right there on the image itself, then you can use the types of props and themes that are being done at the time as well to kind of get you into that ballpark era. And I don't know how well you can see this photo here, but for those of you who are sitting closer, what do you notice in the picture? If you were to date this, what decade or era would you put this in?
What are they standing in front of? I don't know what the background is.
So it's a studio portrait, and it looks like almost like they're standing in a theater with a curtain behind them on one side and a wall with a wall sconce behind her.
Right.
I'd say
Her dress,
1915.
To 20.
20s, yeah.
You probably can't see it because it's a little washed out down here. They're both wearing white shoes,
Yeah.
male and female. See how her hair is really short and she's got really tight pin curls in her hair? It's harder to see for those of you who are in the back. You probably can't even see it at all. You know, he's got a kerchief tucked into his pocket. He's got a double-breasted suit on. This photo was actually taken in the late 1930s, but you could ballpark it to anywhere from the mid-20s to the early 40s, based on her clothing style, that straight kind of simple 1920s era, you know, just before the Depression style of clothing. She's got a great big bow. You can't really see it all that well in this photo. But by looking, I can cheat because I can look up the photographer and see when the photographer was in business. But if he wasn't, what kind of details and props can I pull together? So I'm going to walk you through that. We're going to do clothing styles first, and then I'm going to talk about photographers' backgrounds. And you'll start to notice as you're going through your own photos, I've seen that background, I've seen that table, I've seen that chair. And you could start to pull those together that have the same features and try to build together a potential family out of them. And I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. How many of you have Civil War era photos that have tax stamps on the back of them? They almost look like postage stamps. If you are lucky enough that you have a photo from the Civil War era that has one of those tax stamps on it, they only did this for a little over 18 months during the Civil War. So from 1863 until the end of the war in July of 1865, the Union, in order to raise money to support the troops, started taxing people for luxury goods. So luxury goods would be things like buying property. So if you have any deeds that have that stamp on it, it's because you were paying that luxury tax to support the war effort. Obviously in the North, not in the South. So you're not going to see it in Confederate photographs from that era. But it would be things like photographs, photo albums, jewelry, carriages or wagons, mirrors, anything that was considered a luxury during the war. So it wouldn't be things like food, it wouldn't be things like general clothing, it would just be expensive and fancy clothing where you would see that tax applied. Now the downside to tax stamps is the fact that if you bought an entire album that had 20 photos in it, they only had to put one tax stamp on the back of one of them. So then the hunt is on, right? If you've got these albums, to try to slide the photos out gently to see if there's a tax stamp on the back of just one of them. But the tax stamp could be anywhere from 1 cent to 5 cents typically for photographs. You wouldn't see anything more expensive unless you were dealing with things like real estate, and you would see a more expensive tax. But what they would do is they would put the stamp on the back, and then the photographer would write his initials across it to prove that you had paid for the album and that you had paid the tax. So you can potentially find some that don't have signatures on them. A couple of reasons. They might have skirted out on paying the tax, or more likely the photographer just forgot to initial one of them. But the initials across the back of it are for the photographer. So in this particular one it says DCP, which was for DC Pratt, who was the photographer that took these photos and put this album together. Like I said, the beauty of this is the fact that you're looking at like a 19-20 month window. So if you find one of those stamps, you know you've got between 1863 and July of 1865, to which then the rest of your photos can work around. So if you have one of these and you have other photos that look similar, or from the same photographer with the same background or the same print to their name, you can put those all together and feel assured that these all come from that same era. So the tax stamp gives you the date. The props and the photographer's mark on the front or the back give you the rest of the information. Does that make sense? I teach a lot of classes, and I actually take a lot of classes about digitizing and making records available digitally through our state archives in Illinois, through the National Archives. I attended a program called School for Scanning in Minneapolis a number of years ago to kind of help us have best practices for digitizing and scanning our documents. And one of the processes they walked us through was a process that's called active seeing. Have any of you ever heard of this term before? So basically what you do with active seeing is you're looking at a photograph and you are reciting what it is that you are seeing. And the reason you verbalize this is because if I just look at a photo, and I'm going to show you a photo and I'm going to have you all work on this. If I look at a photo, I might see one or two details in it. I might be able to pull out some specific things that I find interesting. By verbally saying what I see in the picture, I find a lot more detail. So I know it sounds a little crazy that you're going to be speaking to yourself in a room, or if you're with your family, they're going to be like, what are they doing in there? But by saying it out loud, your brain automatically looks for new details and more information. So when you're doing this process, have a piece of paper with you and write down what you see, but don't just write it down, say it out loud, because you'll be surprised at how much more detail you see in that photograph than if you just look at it and write down what you see. So you're looking for things like I mentioned earlier. What is it made out of? What type of photograph is it? You know, what is the makeup of it? Is it a black and white? Is it a color photograph? Is it a studio portrait? Is it a candid photograph? Is it taken inside or outside? How many people are in the photo? And be specific. Don't just say it's a family photo. Be specific. There's an older man, there's a younger woman, there's 4 boys, there's 3 girls. The girls look younger than the boys, and actually say out loud what it is that you're seeing in the photograph. If there are vehicles, if there are buildings in the photograph, then say out loud what it is you're seeing. I see an old school bus, or I see a church behind them. Can I tell what kind of church it is? Is there a sign on the front of the building that announces the denomination? Say all of that out loud, because you'll start to pull out those details. Things like jewelry, like I said, wedding rings and eyeglasses and ear piercings and things like that you're looking for when you do this. So you ready to practice? Mm-hmm. All right.
Go for it.
So take a look at this photo. I'll back up so that you can see it too, Jeanette. So I'm going to pause for 30 seconds because I really want you to take a look at this photo and try to see the types of details that you see in it. And then I'm going to move away from it and I'm going to ask you what it was that you saw. So I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, are you ready? What time of year was it?
Summer.
Summer? Okay. Anybody else have? No. I want to hear your guesses. Summer? Spring or fall? Are we urban or rural?
Urban.
Urban. Okay. Was it a man or a woman?
Man.
Okay. What was he driving?
Truck. Kind of a truck with a cylinder on the back of it.
Okay.
Fire truck, yeah.
Did you see what the businesses were behind him?
Star Jewelry.
The hat shop.
Hat shop?
Straw hats.
Straw hats. We're going to come back to that in just a second. What was the road made out of?
It was dirt.
Dirt.
Okay. Let me think of what other details I can have you pull out of it. Did you get the name that was on the truck?
I saw it, but I couldn't read it.
Okay. All right, so let's go back to it for a second. You might not be able to see it because it's so dark. It's a brick street. So there's a brick street here. I don't know if this will work on here. No, it doesn't work. Johnson Oil is the name of the company that he's driving the truck for. The straw hats. When do you sell straw hats?
Summer.
Do you sell them in the summer? Or are you trying to get people excited about summer?
Spring. Oh,
And here's why I ask. You probably can't see. Can you see what he's wearing?
Got a jacket on.
He's got a jacket on, a hat, and
Gloves.
he's wearing gloves. So summer's a great guess because of the hats in the window.
Can't
But-
see it that well.
But it's probably early spring because they're getting ready for the season, so they're selling boaters, but he's still wearing a heavy jacket. And he still has gloves on. They could be driving gloves, but they look a little bit heavier than that. Albert's Haberdashery, so you've got the hat store behind it, right? It's got the address of the building up across the header. We've got Star Jewelry Store here in the window as well. What you probably can't see on the far side is It's like a photography studio slash calendar store. And there's photos and calendars in the window for that particular year. Is there enough information to look this photo up? So
Yes.
could I go into a newspaper and look up Albert's Haberdashery or Star Jewelers?
Google it.
Or exactly. Or look through city directories or phone books. You know, look through old yearbooks, because a lot of times high school yearbooks sold advertising and they would sell ads to local businesses, just to see if I could figure out where Albert's store and Star Jeweler were, because it tells me it's on 715 something, right? Would I be able to look that up? And all of those are clues to help you start to identify who this is. Who do I know in my family that potentially worked for Johnson Oils? Or who in my family lived in this community? Because it's the city of Joliet in Illinois. And Albert's store is no longer in business, but Star Jewelers is 100 years later. They've moved locations. They're no longer on Ottawa Street, which is where I discovered this photo was taken. But what era, what time period is this?
You could probably ask someone about the year of the car.
Exactly.
And
What gives...
especially, I think the tires, I don't know, I don't know enough about it, but those are
Yes!
lighter tires, and it's weird.
Yes! No, you are absolutely 100% correct. I'm so grateful you said that. She's absolutely right. Look at the pneumatic tires.
Okay.
That is a dead giveaway for the era of this vehicle. We know we're dealing with a photo that's taken before 1930, because that's about the time that they changed from pneumatic tires to rubberized tires. So you're right. We are looking for those types of details. Who can identify the type of truck it is? Or if it was a headshot facing, could you read the license plate? Because yearly you would have to renew your plate, and it would have a year on it and potentially a number. You get the license plate number, you go to the state DMV and you ask for a copy. Most states still have their records, their early vehicle registration records. So you would have access to finding out whose car was this based on the license plate number. So details that you're pulling out. That was perfect. Thank you so much. So the car tires and the straw hats were exactly what I was hoping you were going to see in this photo. So now let's talk more about those eras. So for tintypes specifically, a general ballpark era for tintypes would be 1860 to 1885. 1885 is actually a little high. Usually they start to peter out by about 1880. But if you have tintypes, yes, ma'am.
What makes it a tintype?
The material it's made out of. It's actually made out of aluminum. It's not even made out of tin. It's made out of aluminum, but that's what they called them because it was easier to call them tintypes than aluminum types, I guess. But they were very popular during the Civil War era. And a lot of soldiers even claimed that these photos saved their lives, because if they were shot and it hit the tin, it would act as a buffer. People treated tintypes like they were indestructible because they thought because they were made out of metal that they would last forever. So you'll see a lot of them that are pretty seriously damaged. The photos started to chip off, the corners are rusty, because people just thought they could put them through all kinds of environments. But one of the things you'll notice in this era, and you'll notice it, and I apologize, my clicker doesn't work. Look at the background of the photo of the two gentlemen. It is the exact same background of the photo of the two women, but they're not related. They just happen to have been taken at the same photography studio. So you're looking for those backgrounds. I'll show you more when I specifically talk about backgrounds, but you're looking for the types of material that are constructed in this way. So if you find tintypes in your family history as you're going through your collections, I know that in my eras that I'm putting together, this is going to go in the 1860 to 1880 range.
I believe I brought a couple with me.
Did you bring some with
Did you
you?
want to pass them around or anything?
When we turn the lights on, I definitely want to see them.
Do you want to right now or at the end?
Let's do it at the end, because I know
I think that's
other
what
people
they
might
are.
have brought photos with them,
Yeah.
and then that way
Okay.
that'll be perfect to be able to show. Now, none of these exist in a vacuum. A lot of photography styles overlap. So while tintypes are very indicative of this time period, you'll still see other types of photos being produced as well. You'll see daguerreotypes still being produced up until the 1870s. There are embryotypes, which almost have a blue, or a cyanotype, which almost have a blue tint to them. You'll have cabinet cards during this time period too. So they're not, this is the only type of photo you're going to get in that era, but at least you can put them together and say, here's the time period that I'm looking at. Do any of you have the diamonds?
No.
in your collections, these have such an incredibly tiny window. You will see these between like 1891 and 1897. That's when they were really popular. So if you find these in your collection, if you start at 1895, you only have to go a couple years in either direction because they didn't last all that long. But when you see them, they're very specific. And there's a lot of things in this photo. Neither of these two ladies are related. It's just the same type of photograph. But there are other features in this photograph that are very indicative of that 1890, mid-1890s time frame. And I'm going to point a couple of them out to you. One is the high ruffled collars. Very, very popular in the 1890s to have ladies with very roughly, almost Shakespearean type collars on. And while you might not be able to see it, the top knot. Ladies, for some reason, this was a huge fad in the mid-1890s, was to take your hair and tie it in a knot right on top of your head. It's incredibly ugly, in my opinion. But who am I to judge 150, 1,000 years later, right? But if you see somebody with that top knot in their hair and the roughly collar, even if it's not a diamond-shaped photo, I still know I'm dealing with the mid-1890s, with a year or two in either direction. So there's a lot of things in this photo that make it kind of the perfect storm of fads in the 1890s. And it's the diamond print, the roughly collars, and the top knots in their hair. And if you see, their bangs are super, super short, and they're curled under, like barely there across the top of their foreheads. Very, very popular in that era. How many of you have some of these in your collections? These really long, narrow photos. What are they?
I don't know.
In this particular instance, if I were to look at these, what would I think they were from?
High school?
Graduation.
Yeah. They're senior photos. They're graduation photos. They're senior class photos. And very, very specific to a time period. They're very, very popular in the teens up to the mid-20s. So if you have these in your collection, you can ballpark those to a 15-year time frame between 1910 and 1925. Might be a little bit earlier, might be a little bit later, but 1910 to 1925 is a really good window for these types of photos. And there's one detail in these photos which gives you an even further piece of information for you to dig even deeper. In 2 out of 3 of these photos, they have the names of the high school right on it, or the initials of the high school. So I know that I'm going to look for Joliet Township High School. I know that I'm going to look for Plainfield High School. They might not have ever graduated. They might have started their senior year and something might have happened. Both of these gentlemen wound up enlisting in the First World War. Neither of them went overseas. They stayed stateside. The war ended too soon. But both of them enlisted. All 3 of them did graduate, but just because you have one of these photos, don't make the assumption that they did. You could still look through high school records. You could still look through school records. Don't just automatically assume I'm going to jump to look for a graduation announcement. They might not have gotten there. But still look for a senior class photo or a junior class photo, sophomore, freshman year photos, see what you can find. But the blessing in both of these is the fact that it tells me exactly what school it is. So even if I didn't know who the children were, the young adults were in the photo, if I could match it up to a senior photo in a class photo or a yearbook, then I have my name because it tells me where to go to look for it. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
How many of you have photo postcards? I think every one of us probably has a photo postcard in our family collection because these were ubiquitous from the 1900s to about 1920. Really, really heavy between 1905 and 1912. You'll still see them after that, but the heyday of these is 1908, between 1908 and 1910. There's millions of them out there. And if you haven't looked, how many of you have ever heard of the Card Cow website?
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah. Go out to Card Cow because it's a for-profit, it's a business. The guy buys and sells postcards, but I found postcards from my hometown in there. You know, where it's showing you the picture of the church, right, or the local courthouse, or it's a photo of a scenic scene nearby. But occasionally, there's a lot of photos of individuals, right, that might not be named. There might not be any information on the back, but then you might get some beauties where they actually put them in the mail. and sent them to their family. And if they put them in the mail and sent them to their family, not only do you have the addresses for both parties sometimes, but I've got a postage stamp from the post office that tells me exactly what date it arrived at the post office. So I've got that information up at the top as well. So I've got the address of who it's going to, the postal stamp from where it came from, and if I'm lucky enough that they wrote a little note, you know, oh, here's me from my last trip, or here's a new photo of the baby, then I've got some great information. This one for Lila was never put through the mail, but the family was kind enough to tell me that it was Lila Kanagi who was listed in the photo. And we have several pictures of her at our historical society. So I can look at her because she has very unique features. So I can look through photos and pull her out of other photos because I have one that has her name on it. So I can spot her in other things. Just because as she aged, she had a very unique look about her. But this particular one of the Burkett kids was put through the mail, and I do have the address and the date that in which they sent that. So these, again, start around 1910 and then work a decade in either direction until you can figure it out. We all have these, right? These war, post-war, Art Deco, Art Nouveau cardboard frames that photos came in. Again, very distinctive, very easy to identify with a particular time period. You know, the Art Deco, Art Nouveau look was very, very popular immediately after the First World War, leading up to the Korean War. If you're lucky enough that you have soldier photos in it, can anybody see what branch of service he's in?
See there.
He's got the world with the eagle. He's in the Marines. So just by being able to identify the pin on his hat, okay, who in my family could have potentially been in the Marines, either in the Second World War or Korea, right? Because that was the time period in which these were very, very popular. Same with the woman in the photo. Her hairstyle, where she's got the tight pin curls put in, the floral dress that she's wearing, the neckline was a very, very popular neckline in the 1940s. So I'm looking at those details and pulling that out to say, okay, who looks like they're about 30 that would have been in this area, because it's got Riviera Studios on it, that would have been wherever Riviera Studios is between 1945 and 1955. Military service and outfits and clothing styles have a tendency to follow any type of military engagement. So if you can see the baby boy in the far right corner, what type of outfit is he wearing?
It looks like a sailor suit.
Yeah, he's wearing a sailor's outfit, right? From the Civil War, First World War, Second World War, children's clothing styles mimic what is going on in the military environment as well. So you'll see dresses, I'll show you some, Civil War era where they've got stars and stripes and epaulets that are very indicative of military uniforms. Children's outfits where they've got little sailor or little army uniform type clothing on, tight pleats and things like that are following what's going on in the military as well. So if I come across a photo like this, I'm going to try to say what military engagement might have been going on that this child's clothing is representing. How many of us have Kodak? Have Polaroids, right? There are multiple eras, there are multiple styles of Polaroid film that you probably all recall. When it first came out, really to the general public after the Korean War, even though they were out by 1948, they were on a hard cardboard strata. They didn't bend, they didn't fold. It wasn't like the 1970s ones where you had to shake it to get your image, right? You had to send these in and they had to be produced and sent to you. So the very first round of Polaroids had a really hard background on them. It's like they glued the photo onto a cardboard backing, just like carte de visites in the 1870s and 80s. By the 1970s, by the late 60s into the late 70s, they were not as stiff, but they weren't as floppy as what we think of when we think of Polaroids. So in the first two incarnations of Polaroids, they could take damage. If you look at this photo, you can see that the photo is damaged. There's cracks in it. It's dried out. It's been abused over the years. It's falling apart. If we did that with one of the last incarnations of Polaroids, we'd lose the image right away. Because they weren't designed to, the gas that was inside them, if the photo cracked or was cut, you would lose the image. So 3 different eras, but every single one of them is still a Polaroid. And now Polaroids are in fashion again. Preteens and tweens cannot get enough of Polaroid cameras. They sell them at every hobby and craft store that you go into. So they're starting to come back as a fad all over again. I mean, come on, don't we kind of miss that sound? You know, the right? We gotta shake it. It's even made its way into music. Shake it like a Polaroid picture. So our dogs Brutus and Christy, before I was born, my sister in the late 1960s, and then me by 1980, 3 different styles of Polaroid camera photos. So let's talk about those clothing styles and accessories. What are we looking for? When you look at these photos, what story instantly comes to mind?
Little Lord Fauntleroy.
Exactly. Right? Does anybody not know who Little Lord Fauntleroy was? Right? So Little Lord Fauntleroy was a story, and I don't remember who it was written by, but it was a very unique style of clothing. Very frilly, very ornate, very fancy. You know, it's supposed to be like royalty. So the little boy on the far side, it's Walter Harshbarger. He's got the real tight curls, right? He's got the frilly collar, right? The puffy sleeves, the short pants, right? It was just a style very indicative of the turn of the century. So if you have Little Lord Fauntleroy photos in your collections, you know you're dealing with roughly 1898 to 1906, if you have this style, you know. And while they're smiling, poor Walter, look at him, he's like, oh, get me out of this, just get me out of this outfit, I can't take it. But when we look at Harry Gray in this photo, he's all smiles. And there's a couple of reasons why Harry Gray's all smiles. He was just a good guy. But the style of clothing that they're wearing gives me a very specific time period. But there's one more prop in here that gives me a date and a time.
Very good.
It's tricycle, right? How many of you are familiar with what was called the Good Roads movement? So the Lincoln Highway comes out of this Good Roads movement because people were crazed to ride their bicycles. And we're not talking 2 wheels like what you see on the street today. We're talking the tall 6-foot tricycles, right? Grown men and women couldn't get enough of riding their tricycles around town. And you can't do that on a dirt or gravel road. You can't do that with a road that's in poor shape. So there was a huge push in the 1890s to improve roads so that they could ride their bicycles. So for Harry Gray to be photographed with a tricycle tells me that this photo is earlier than Walter's, that we're dealing with the late 1890s. Because this would have been the prop that you were going to see in all kinds of photos in that time period. Just like telephones. You see telephones pop up in a lot of photos in the 1920s because they're new and people are excited to get their picture taken with them. And you look at the chair off to the side, you know, very distinct style of chair. When you're dealing with children's photographs, what do you know about young boys' fashions, right? What did they wear first?
Dresses.
They wore dresses or gowns, right? Until they were
Toilet trained.
toilet trained, right? And then they moved to short pants,
Knickers.
right? They went to knickers. They went to knickerbocker pants until they were,
10.
until they hit puberty, give or take, right? Usually confirmation or bar mitzvah, right about that time period, right about that time they turned 12 or 13. And then they can move to long pants because now they're considered young adults, right? So if I see a little boy who's wearing these pants, I know that he's potty trained and he's in between those eras, right? He's no longer wearing dresses. He's been potty trained. He's now wearing pants, but he's not old enough yet to be wearing long pants as well. So we're looking at those types of details in the photographs as well. And I do have a photo of 2 siblings, and I'm going to ask you the same question again about, is it a boy or is it a girl? Styles again, styles of clothing that we're looking for. You look at the hats and the hairstyles in this photo, what would you think? Girls all have really short bobbed hair. 1920s or after, right? 20s, 30s, 40s, after, right? Can you see the boys' hats? They're wearing newsboy hats, right, which would have been very popular in the teens and the 20s. Well, it's still popular, but it would have been really popular in the teens and 20s. What time of year is it?
Winter.
Because they're wearing heavy jackets and coats and hats, right? Except for some of the kids, right? So we're looking at probably a class photo, and I really zoomed this in so you could see the detail. If you look at the girls' dresses, right, they're wearing the frock dresses, which were very popular in the mid-20s. You know, very simple, very straight-lined, not frilly in any way. I'm looking at a class photo from the 20s or 30s, right? And you're going to put that into that pile. Who would have been in 3rd, 4th grade in that time period? What about here?
1880s. Bustle.
That's
Because
a
of the
bustle,
bustle.
yeah, that was earlier, wasn't it?
It is. It depends on how fashionable you were and how much money your family had. We're talking 1870s, right?
Yeah.
Post-Civil War, 1870s. That's where you're going to get a lot of that military styling as well. But bustles were very popular in the 1870s and 1880s. But I'm also looking at the background. The more ornate the backdrop from the photographer, the more recent the photograph is taken. When early photography is coming out and you're getting carte de visites and daguerreotypes in the 1850s, early 1860s, you're talking simple backgrounds against a blank wall. You might get a 1 or 2 line border around the outside of the photo on the cardboard, but there's no ornamentation behind them. After that Civil War to I wouldn't even say mid, I'd probably say early 1870s would be carpets. They're going to hang a carpet behind you, and that's going to be the decoration. Once you get to 1871 going forward, you're going to start to see more of these fancy backgrounds where you've got jungle themes. I have one with a spider web. Yeah, spiders aren't my thing, but they're a lot more ornate, and they get more ornate until you hit about 1890, and then it starts to go back to something a little more staid and plain. So the background tells me it's more fancy. It's not just a carpet. We're dealing post 1871. But then I'm also looking for the style of the furniture as well. Her hairstyle, how she's got her hair still pulled back, but the tight curls across the front of her forehead. I'm going to be looking for all of those details to narrow it down from 1870 to 1885 to slowly starting to narrow that down into a tighter window. And we're going to do that based on potentially the jewelry she's wearing, the style of her hair, the clothes, the chair that she's leaning against. All of those things are going to be specific to a time period. I'm going to come back to the ubiquitous chair in just a second, but sometimes, especially with studio portraits, right? You're spending a lot of money to get a studio portrait done, so you're going to dress to the nines. You're going to look your best. You're going to go out of your way to make sure that you're dressed to impress. So these two ladies are doing just that. And this one might be a little bit harder to date. But I'll give you a clue. It's the 19-teens. And there are 2 things in this photo that kind of give away their economic status. The time of year, right? What time of year would this be? I would not be standing in these coats with these minks in the middle of summer. But they're wearing driving coats. And they've got driving gloves in their hands. Which means they had, or somebody did, they rode with somebody, because driving coats are a very specific thing. When I talk about how to look things up and I talk about looking in old catalogs and things, road coats, driving coats were a very real thing. Look at the style of her hat. Who do you think of when you see a hat like that?
Queen Mary.
No, I'm thinking more of a guy, a military officer. Napoleon, right? She's a very Napoleonic style hat on. We would have been coming up to the 100th anniversary of the Napoleonic Wars in the 19-teens. And there was a lot of styling that revolved around that particular century, those battles. Battle of Borodino, the War of 1812, the song 1812 Overture is written about. And her hat, you see how it just rests on the top of her head? It doesn't really sit down the brim doesn't sink down onto her forehead. It was very popular in 1914, 1915. And after that, if you look through magazines, if you look at Better Homes and Gardens, which was around, if you look at, other magazines, you slowly start to see the hat sink and sink and sink until they sit right on the eyebrow. So by just looking at how high their hats are sitting on their head also gives me a year or a couple of years in which that was a very popular style. But their hat's sitting on top of her head and the fact that they're both wearing driving coats gives me a very specific window of time. And what you might not be able to see in this young lady's photograph, she's got a picture of a young man in a brooch on her dress. What would we call that?
A mourning brooch.
It's a mourning brooch. It's mourning jewelry, right? She's wearing a piece of clothing or wearing a piece of jewelry that's indicative of somebody in her family that she lost. It could be her fiance or her husband. It could be a brother or a sibling. We don't quite know, but he's been immortalized in the photograph because she's wearing that piece of jewelry on her clothing. Here's another example of one. Both of the young boys in this photo are wearing a button of a tiny baby.
Was that a mink collar on their coats?
It was a mink collar, yes it was. What do we know about mourning customs? For ladies in the US and in Western Europe, if somebody in your family died, what would you typically wear?
Black.
You'd wear black. What type of material do you know? You'd wear crepe. And if you've ever worn crepe, it's incredibly itchy and uncomfortable. And it's poisonous because they use arsenic in order to make the fabric crinkle. Note to self, don't wear crepe.
Or lick it.
Do lick, exactly. Don't lick crepe paper either, like if you're hanging streamers. Don't lick crepe paper. But if you notice in the photograph, and it's hard to see, both what I'm assuming is mother and grandmother are both wearing black crepe dresses, mourning style dresses. We've got the high collars, they're made out of crepe, very plain and simple. The children are both wearing the button of the child that has died. The girls are wearing white. In some ethnic cultures, when somebody dies, they don't wear black, they wear white. Especially in a lot of Eastern European cultures. So if you see photos and everybody's wearing white and they've got mourning jewelry on, it's the opposite of what we're familiar with here in the States, that everybody in the family would wear white as well for a time period. And this time period, depending on who dies, could last anywhere from a couple of months to a couple of years. It depends on the significance of the person who passes away. That's where you would see the armbands for the men. And for women and for men, it would shrink. The armband would get more and more narrow based on how close you are to the end of your mourning period. Same thing with your calling cards and your letterheads. That black border would get thinner and thinner depending on as the time goes on until you're finally out of your mourning period. So here are some things. You probably are familiar with all of these. Right? We look at this young lady. There could be a couple of things going on in this particular photo. It could be a graduation photo. It could be...
Confirmation.
If it were a confirmation photo, what would we... Yes, what else would we be looking for? She probably wouldn't be holding flowers.
Rosary?
You're right, rosary, a Bible. There might be a candlestick behind her, something that's indicative of that particular religious culture. So because she's not holding a Bible or a rosary, what kind of assumption can we make?
Graduation.
That it potentially could be a graduation photo. And actually, I don't know about the rest of you, but even when I graduated, I'm not going to tell you the year, but it was a considerable sum ago, all of us had to wear white as well. We all had to wear white for graduation. So she's wearing white, she's got the white boots. I would kill to have these boots today. But it's actually an 8th grade graduation photo. And what gives it away is the fact that she's got the big bow in her hair. As young ladies mature and they stop being young girls and become young women, they don't wear the bows in their hair anymore. So this tells me it's not a high school graduation because she would not have the bow. So those are details to look for in the photo. This photo here, you can't see her, but she's got open-toed white shoes on. What do we notice about the background?
They're outside.
They're outside. What time of year is it?
Spring or summer.
It's summer, and I know it's hard to see because the lighting is bad, but it's summer because the trees are fully leafed out. So look for those types of details. Are there leaves on the trees? Are there leaves on the ground? Is it spring or fall? Are there leaves on the trees, but everybody's in jackets because it's fall and it's gotten cold, but the leaves haven't dropped yet? You're looking for those types of details. He's got a cigarette in his hand. and a brownie camera, and he's taking a picture of the person who's taking a picture of them, right? He's got a boutonniere. So this is actually my grandparents. This is Grandpa Casey and my Grandma Jean. He's taking a picture of his brother who's taking a photo of him at his brother's second wedding to the same bride.
Long story.
Yeah. He married Catherine twice, but my grandparents stood up in the second wedding before they were married. There's no wedding rings on either of their fingers. So they're a couple, but they're not married yet. So there's a lot of details in this that I'm looking for. And remember what I said about is it a boy or is it a girl? What do we have? Do we have 5 girls or 4 girls and a boy? I'm going to say 4 girls and a boy. There are a couple of clues. Do you know why?
That belt, yeah.
Yeah, it's more masculine. The belt in it, boys who were wearing, I don't want to say dresses, but boys who were wearing gowns it would either be tightly pleated, it would be more military in style, or it would have a belt. So we're dealing with 4 sisters and a brother who's standing here on the chair. And you notice the girls have the bows in their hair. They've got like every piece of jewelry they own. Mom was like, all right, you're going to stand very still for this portrait. And I do have pictures of them as they age and progress as well. Oops, one too far. Occupations. How many of you are lucky enough to have photos of your ancestors or family at work? All right. What kind of job does she do? Nurse. She's a nurse. You might not be able to see it, but she's got a monocle. She has just one glass, right? And you can see the chain that goes across and around her ear, which is kind of cool, right? We've got things like bakers. We've got things like interurban line or railroad train drivers and things like that. This is Eddie Gardner. My husband just heard me talk. He just walked in. Just heard me talk all about Eddie Gardner this past weekend because I was in Holdridge, Nebraska, doing research on Eddie Gardner. Know who it could potentially be. Who in your family would have been of age to be, taking part in the First World War? How about this one?
The Civil War.
What gives it away?
Beaird.
The beard. His collar, the beard, right? The hairstyle. The simplicity, there's no background. Right? Remember what I said about how the earliest photos would have 1, maybe 2 lines around the border? That was it. There was nothing else to the background of the photo. So this is a Civil War era photo. This one was actually taken in Amsterdam, New York. This one's a little harder. Any ideas? He's a cadet. He has not finished school yet. He's got his gloves. He's got his cadet's uniform. He's got a sword. It's the Spanish-American War. He was actually killed in 1903 during the Philippine portion of the Spanish-American War. How about these adorable guys?
World War
That's
II.
World. No, I would have said 1.
Actually, it's Korea.
Oh, really?
And the hats are backwards because they were in a photo booth in Korea, and when it printed, everything was backwards. So very much like a tintype, where a tintype you'd have to reverse because it's actually done in a backwards process. But this is Korean War era, right? How about this one?
World War II.
Yeah.
World War II. What kinds of details can I pull out of this about him?
His rank.
I can pull out his rank, where he's been stationed, what he's seen, right? Do you see the wings?
Some of them,
Right, so there's a lot of information there. Even if I didn't know who the person was, I could tell you that they were in the Army Air Corps. I could tell you that they are, I believe, are a sergeant, because there's 3 stripes on bars on his side. I could tell you whether he's in the Pacific or in the European theater based on the ribbons on his jacket. So there's a lot of information that you can glean just by looking at these photos. So instead of just saying Navy, what else can I pull out of this to figure it out? So here's Elmer. Elmer served in both the First World War and the Second World War. He served in the Signal Corps in both the First World War and Second World War. And on his collar here, you can't really see it, and then on his uniform, he's got the Signal Corps insignia in both. So I know that he was in the same unit. I can go look for records for him between the two wars. I'm going to come back to Elmer in just a few minutes. So now let's talk about those props and backgrounds. You're starting to get an idea of the eras and the time periods. You might have an idea of the location where it happened to take place. But we're looking for this type of information in the background. So remember what I said, the more ornate and elaborate, we're talking post 1870, but before 1890. So we're looking in that time period for this. I'm going to look up Taylor as a photographer and find out when he was in business. The chairs or the tables or the tablecloths that are being used are going to tell you something about when and where it was taken. So we've got the same chair in this photo with the same background, same chair in this photo with the same background. You're looking for those similarities in your photo collections. You're looking for those and you're putting those together. And these, in fact, are all siblings. So I've got the two older brothers and then the younger brother, taken at different times, but obviously taken at the same photography studio. And you can see it, it's kind of blacked out here, but you can see the name at the bottom. This is the ubiquitous chair. I can guarantee you every single one of you in your family collections has at least one photo with this darn chair in it. Because it was everywhere across the globe. So this picture is taken in Naperville, Illinois. There's the ubiquitous chair. This one's taken in North Aurora, Illinois. This one's taken in Scotland. This one's taken in Kansas. This one's taken in Iowa. That chair is everywhere. 1865 to 1875. So this one's like, well, actually earlier. This one's 1864, 1866, 1862, 1871, right about 1875. So the chair is awful. It's going to show up in all of your pictures, and it lasted forever. So you've got like a 20-year window that if you see this chair, everybody had that chair. It was everywhere. So if you see this chair, and I'm going to show it to you in another photo that was 1880, you're going to see it in that window. It's everywhere. But other things you're looking for, I've got this chair and tablecloth. Same chair, same tablecloth. Same tablecloth. Same chair, same tablecloth. Same chair. You're just looking for those connections between photos. All of the tin types are all the same photo. This is a different, unrelated person, but from the same community. And this particular photo, because it's done as a carte de visite, because it's done on cardboard, it has the photographer's mark on it. The tin types don't. So I know they all lived in the same community. I have the name of the photographer for hers, so I can make the assumption that he took all of the photos in that community, and I can look up those dates. But it's the same prop, probably all taken on the same day. Hers is tinted. Her dress is tinted green, and her cheeks are tinted. And I think they did that because she wound up dying shortly after. And I think they went and made the photo a little bit dressier to kind of honor her after she passed. But back to that idea of photography marks, right? If you're lucky enough that it tells you that I've got Stanton's photography studio in Amsterdam, New York, I can look through phone books, city directories, I can look through county histories and a number of other resources, newspapers, to figure out when that studio was in business. And in your handout, I give you some websites too. I'll mention those in a little bit, where I can find out more information. So for this particular one, it says pictures made and retouched from negatives. So I can have a photo remade at this studio based on the era in which this photographer was doing that. I'm going to show you a photo that I think is a copy, and I'll tell you why I think it's a copy in just a little bit. And then Giles, new ground floor studio, I want you to remember this, corner of LaSalle and Benton Streets in Aurora. I'm going to come back to Giles in just a second. Now what happens if you have a photographer that was in business for almost 50 years? How on earth did you possibly figure out what era your particular photo was taken? You're following the type of photography mark. You remember what I said about these being specific to the 1890s? Right? So I'm working backwards. But it says Pratt's New Photography Group at the corner of Giles and LaSalle. Wait a second. I thought the other one was just at the corner of, Giles was just at the corner of LaSalle and Benton. DC Pratt, you can't see it here, DC Pratt, DC Pratt, DC Pratt, DC Pratt. Why is it just called Pratt's now? He could have died. He could have retired and turned the business over to somebody else, right? Or he could have just sold out completely and the original photographer, the new photographer kept the name. Giles, new ground floor studio at the corner of LaSalle and Benton. Giles bought out Pratt. Same location, the corner of LaSalle and Benton Streets, but I follow Pratt from I've got a Civil War era stamp, so I know he's in business in 1863 all the way up to 1895. And if you reach out to the society or the historical society in that community, they could probably tell you what era each photographer's stamp is as well. So using those catalogs in those advertising catalogs, Sears, Marshall Fields, whatever it happens to be, Sears Home Kits, whatever it happens to be, those catalogs are really insightful. City directories and newspapers are going to have information about those photographers as well. Here's an example of a photo. I've got a picture of a jardiniere, of a Moroccan-style jardiniere. I can start looking through furniture catalogs for that time period to find a matching table. And then I have an era. This table was out in this catalog in this year, and I know that it wasn't before this, but it could be after it. So if that chair or that table comes out in 1898, then I know the photo is 1898 or later. Charles Murr, Studio 39 Jefferson Street in Joliet, Illinois. The only city directory we have in that time period is 1873, and it tells me that Charles Murr is at 410 Jefferson. Why the discrepancy? They could have moved. He could have moved down the block into a new address, a new building. The city could have renumbered. So ask the question, did your city rename or renumber streets at any point in that period as well? Because he could have stayed in the same location, but now he has a new address. And in his particular case, I have a very specific answer, because in the newspaper from September of 1879, it tells me that his entire studio caught fire and burned to the ground. So the 39 Jefferson is probably because his building burnt down and he had to move to a new location. And this is how I found that information, was just by looking in the local newspaper. Fold 3 is a great place to find information about studios and photographers as well. They're mostly just mid to large size cities. You're not going to find small towns. You're not going to find Buffalo. You're going to find New York City. But there are a lot of other places in your handout where you can look for city directories to do that searching. But they're going to have all kinds of information about the studio, where it is, how much they cost, if they ran an ad. Langdon's list, you've got it in your handout. She has a pretty elaborate list of photographers for New York. So she's got a really extensive list, alphabetical by name, of the studio. And if you find yours isn't there, you can reach out to her and she will add it to her list, and she'll try to do a little bit of research for you. But there are other sites out there where you can do that same search. How many of you have photos of somebody who's young and somebody who's old and you're trying to match them up? Or you're working backwards, right? So here's Elmer when I met him. I absolutely adored him. He was part of the first dozen oral history interviews I did for the Library of Congress. And there's no doubt when I look at one and the other that I'm dealing with the same person. But there are certain traits that you're looking for, whether you're doing age progressions or age regressions, right? You know, Elmer has a very specific eyebrow, and you'll notice this in people. Certain things never change. You might lose your hair, but your hair's, the way your hair lays is going to be the same. If it parts this way, it's not all of a sudden going to part the other way. The distance in your earlobes are either attached or they're not. If you have a cleft chin or not, the distance between your eyes and your nose, all of that stays the same. Elmer has a very specific smirk that he has. I'm going to show you another one in just a second. The way people tilt their head, the way they stand, everything about somebody's demeanor comes out in their photographs, and you start to pick these little traits out for people as you're going through photos. He doesn't smile. I have lots of photos of Elmer. He never smiles. You never see his teeth in photos. But what's called hooding above the eyes, where their eyes almost appear sunken, that's something that doesn't change. That stays the same from decade to decade. Here's Janet. Janet was 4'6" if she was an inch. She was an incredibly tiny woman, but just the really sharp part to her hair, she just really liked the same styles of things from year to year to year. You know, you could follow the distance of her eyebrows, how broad her chin is. You know, here's her and her son and her daughter. And it's freakish that her grandson looks exactly like his father at the same age, even though I can see that Janet has probably aged by 30 years. How she tilts her head, how she holds her shoulders, all of those things remain constant. So this is Alex and his sister Marion. I've got the pictures of Alex and Marion as young children. She had the most piercing eyes you will ever see, so I can follow her gaze from photo to photo because they just stand out. Alex has a weird little colic that follows him through every picture that I have of him, even as a grown man. He still has this one piece that just sticks off in its own direction. Alex becomes really easy to see in photos as well. And then we're going to talk about Janet. I showed you Elmer already once, and then Clinton King was one of those high school graduation photos I showed you. So here's their picture in 1908. They're about in 5th or 6th grade. Janet kept that smirk the rest of her life. She lived to be 99 years old, and she still has that exact same smirk, even at 99 years old. So just how she has bags under her eyes, you know, just the way she looks, the lines that she has very thin lips. I can follow each of them. I can follow Elmer because the taxi cab doors are still open in the photo. He's got ears that stand out like there's no tomorrow. And then same thing with Clinton. You know, see how he's got the little cleft in his chin? Like all of that stays the same. You'll start to pick people out in your photos. We're briefly just going to work backwards. So I had all of these pictures of Allie. I had her after her first child was born, her wedding photo to Reverend Thomas Burnett, and then before she got married. How many of you use Fulton Postcards website?
Oh, yeah.
Right, you're very familiar with Tom Trankenan and the wonderful things he does. He had an album on his website that was just listed as unidentified album. And I was like, all right, I want to take a look through it. And I'm flipping through it, and I'm like, oh, this looks neat. And then I came across this picture, and I apologize for this, of a woman who was so shockingly unattractive that I actually stopped and was like, whoa. I had to look at it again, like, wow. Brought me back into hyper-focus. And as I started finishing the album, I'm like, wait a second, I know these people. I know this family. I think this is Allie's family. So I pulled out my album, reached out to Tom and said, I think these are my people. And he said, okay, tell me why. And I started going through both of our albums and pulling those photos together. So I have all of these photos of Allie from about 1870 to 1880. And he had this photo. And I was like, that's Allie. And he's like, well, what makes you so sure? And I said, because she really likes the really sharp, tight part down the middle of her hair. She really likes fluffy, frilly collars, right? She has pierced ears, which she's got pierced ears, like, that's Allie. He's like, well, I don't know if I'm so convinced. I said, but wait, there's more. I had this picture of her in-laws, the Burnetts, James Burnett and his wife, Elizabeth. And he had this photo. And he's like, all right, the guy looks like, all right, maybe that could be the same guy. I said, oh, no. I said, look at how stern and plain Elizabeth is. I said, this is absolutely Elizabeth. And as we started going through, there were 30 photos between the two albums that I could compare that were almost identical to the people in the earlier album. So I'd reached out to Tom and I said, well, can I buy it? And he says, oh, I don't have it anymore, but I can give you higher resolution scans. I said, that'll be fine, that's perfect. But we went through and we worked through and we were able to identify almost everybody in that album. So if you look at a photo and you're like, that looks like Grandpa Jack, there's a reason for that. And keep that in mind. You know, when you're looking at people and you're like, I know he's older in this photo, but that really looks like my brother at that age. Who else in the family could potentially look like that relative? I think I look like my Grandpa Casey. Nobody else thinks I look like my Grandpa Casey. But we're the only two in the family with dimples. So I get that one trait from my Grandpa Casey. Right? I showed you this photo already of Uretta and her mother. There's no doubt that they're mother and daughter. And then my good friend Marion, who has since passed, was so shockingly similar to her great-grandmother, Marion, that the first time I met her, I actually gasped. And I said, you look so much like your great-grandmother. She says, I know, I get that a lot. But she did. I mean, it was shocking how much she looked like her great-grandmother. So if you're going through photos and your gut reaction is that looks just like so-and-so, put it in that family pile. Because there's family resemblances that could be very, very strong. How many of you have those in your own family? Like, I look at my kid and I'm like, oh, you look just like, and so sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good. But you have all of these websites at your disposal that you can access whenever you want to learn more about how to identify photographs. Definitely take advantage of all of the books and resources that are available to you out there. Denise May Levenick's book is actually a really good one about how to archive family photos as well. So once you've got them sorted and you have an idea of who they are, she kind of walks you through the process on how to preserve them. But Maureen Taylor, how many of you read her article in Family Tree magazine or have checked out any of her books? She has books on women's clothing styles, on bonnets and hat styles. She's got a lot of really good books to help you identify your photos. So take full advantage of that. So we were just talking at my work today about awkward family photos. And I said I had to share this site with them, which they found to be outrageous. You will truly enjoy it. But probably the biggest thing to keep in mind as you're walking yourself through this process is that it's not going to be done in a day. You're going to use the resources you have. Okay, this photo is probably 1940. It's done at this studio. Who do I know in the family that's from that town in that era? You're going to go through your family trees and you're going to start to try to match up locations. You're going to try to match up family sizes. You're going to try to match up who had 3 boys and 4 girls that could potentially be in this photo. And you're just going to slowly work through it. And I bet you before long, you're going to have plenty of those photos that were once unidentified that are now identified. But I want to see the tintypes that he brought with him if we
I'm
turn the light on.
I'm pretty sure that's what they're called.
Round
I've
of
been-
applause. We have bright lights coming.
And I apologize for running late, but considering how weird all of that was to get started in the first place, thank you for bearing with me. Let's take a look. You got it?